everyone. Welcome to The Secret History of History, Espionage and Enslavement. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted that we have Claire Bellerjeau. Did I say it right,
everyone.
Claire?
Close.
Close. Claire Bellerjeau. And she is here to discuss her book, Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, the true story of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth. Claire is the historian and director of education at Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, New York, and that is the home of the Townsend family. Claire will be joined during the Q&A by her co-author, Tiffany Brooks. I think I got that one right. So Tiffany will be joining us for the Q&A after the presentations. Tiffany has spoken and published widely on early portrayals of race and transatlantic performance, and she was the lead researcher and contributing writer for the New York Times bestselling George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pilots, and Andrew Jackson and the Miracle at New Orleans, and other books. So I was incredibly intrigued when I learned about the book that Claire and Tiffany wrote together. Of course, the Townsend family is very important to us at the Spy Museum because of their involvement in the Culper spy ring during the American Revolution. And it's featured in our museum. So I thought before I turn this over to Claire to tell you more about the world of the Townsends and this fascinating woman, Elizabeth, I thought I'd just give you a quick look at the way the Townsends fit in at the Spy Museum. So let me share my screen with you all. So if you visited the Spy Museum, if you have or if you plan to do it soon, when you get to the fourth floor, you will see this man, who might be familiar to you, America's first spy master, General George Washington. And next to him is one of the jewels of our collection. My computer is there we go. My computer's behaving badly today. This incredible letter is written by George Washington to Nathaniel Sackett, offering him $50 a month. That's slightly more than $1,000 today, to spy for the Continental Army and to set up a spy network. So it's always been incredible to me that we have this letter on display. But Sackett didn't remain in control of spying for Washington very long. Washington turned it over to this man, Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was a young man in his 20s, and he relied on personal contacts to create his spy ring, the Culper Ring. And these were contacts in Long Island around the British-controlled New York City. So at the Spy Museum, we've got our jewel, our letter from George Washington, and you see this is Washington wearing a mask. I think he might be unmasked now because we're just getting ready to go maskless at the Spy Museum. But on the right, you'll see a couple of really cool interactives that folks really enjoy. One is about finding the secrets of John Jay's invisible ink formula. And I don't know if you're going to touch on that, Claire, but you do in the book. And then to the right is an interactive that gives people a chance to explore how intelligence was passed during the Culper Ring, or through the Culper Ring. And we picked a particular moment from July of 1780, and that is when important information is afoot about the French lending support to the Americans, a small fleet heading up to Rhode Island to bring supplies and men. Do the British know what's going to happen? And we take the visitors through the cycle of how the intelligence would be passed to George Washington. And one of the figures is this man, and that is Robert Townsend. That's Claire and Tiffany's one of the subjects in this terrific book. And Robert, Agent 723, codename Culper Jr., He masqueraded as a loyalist to the crown. He's gathering intel from mingling with the British in coffee houses and meetings and in his own business. And then this is a man whose efforts in the spy ring did not come to light until the 20th century. I call that deep, deep cover. So I have lots of questions about that. And if you don't answer them during your presentation, Claire, I will be back at you to ask. I was thrilled to learn about Elizabeth and just more about the world that these people lived and operated in. And so just a reminder to our guests, please send in your questions through the Q&A feature. I will be trying to get to as many of them as possible after Claire's presentation. And so now I'm going to stop sharing and over to you, Claire.
That's great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am excited to be with your community today, and I love your exhibit. That is just so wonderful that the public gets to have fun with those interactives and also really dive into this Culper spy ring. And so I'm going to dive into my presentation too. I'm going to share my screen and get this slideshow starting from the beginning. So Tiffany and I have written this book, Espionage and Enslavement in the Revolution, and it's bringing forward a new story for America, a story of a woman of color and how she experienced the Revolutionary War and how she really got intertwined with the life of this spy, Robert Townsend. But to know about her and to know about him, we have to reflect on the world they lived in. And so Elizabeth was born into slavery. She was enslaved from the first moment of her life, enslaved by the Townsend family, born around 1763. And now that house where she was born is a museum called Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, Long Island. And if anybody comes through Long Island, I urge you to visit our museum and to learn more about this story. Now, the world she was born into had legal slavery in every one of the 13 colonies, and slave ads like these appeared in every newspaper. The colony she was born into, New York, was actually the epicenter of slavery in the North. So, of all the colonies north of Maryland, New York had by far the most slavery. In fact, in 1770, when Liss was just a girl, if you added up all the slavery in the New England colonies and combined them, New York had more, much, much more than Pennsylvania, a colony of a similar size. And if you look down at the very bottom of the colony map, in Georgia in 1770, New York had more slavery. This is not a narrative that is frequently understood by New Yorkers today. Now, decades before Liss was born, there was put into law in 1730 an edict that every town, every village in New York must have an official town slave whipper. And when I looked in our Oyster Bay town records, there were the names of the town appointed Negro whippers. So every town in New York would have had a whipping post like the one you see on the slide, and it would have been in a prominent place in the middle of town. Just last year, I was researching this blacksmith's ledger book in our collection at Raynham Hall. And you can see just hundreds of entries on this single page from 1802. But if you see this blue dot down at the bottom, this entry offers money being paid to the blacksmith for putting a band and bolt on a black, and for 3 wearing irons and 1 ring. So this is a record of an enslaved person being shackled. In the same ledger book in 1808, I found an even more horrific record of the blacksmith being paid to strap a black person for a welt, for a beating, to a wagon tire, with an extra charge for the 12 nails it took to put him on that wheel. This is actually a medieval torture called breaking on the wheel. And in this instance, being done to an enslaved Black person, again, probably in the middle of town and in a quite late year, 1808. So the idea that slavery was somehow better in the North or easier in the North should just be put aside and never thought of again. Slavery in New York was just as horrific as it was in the South. And runaway slave ads like this one appeared in every edition of the newspaper, right alongside ads selling slaves. This one is particularly interesting because it's in our town of Oyster Bay. Who knows? Maybe Liss knew this man named Isaac. He was about 5 feet 10 inches high. He was middle aged. And for about a year, he'd lived in Oyster Bay, telling people that he was free and giving himself the last name Johnston. But his owner, Mr. John Townsend, takes that name away from him and offers people $5 reward if they can find him. He's described as being very ragged. His coat is light and patched with different colors. When enslaved people would run away, they often only had one set of clothes, maybe two, and the clothing they were given was often worn and patched. Now, Robert Townsend was born into this same world, but he had a very different experience. Born in 1753, he was the third son of a very wealthy family of shipping merchants. Now, this isn't the Townsend family in the painting. They never had a family portrait done, but it's what a typical wealthy family would have looked like. And it was a big family. His father, Samuel, was a leading patriot and leader of our town. And he had 5 sons in the family and 3 daughters. And he wasn't the most remarkable of the sons. There were many other that were given more notice in his family, but today he's the one we remember. Today we remember Robert especially because now we know through handwriting analysis that was done in the 1920s that he was the spy for Washington who used the code name Culper Jr. And this would have always been the story that our museum told: a patriot father, a spy son, the Culper spy ring, passing information, how the British took over our town and billeted commanders in our house. And we would have gone on telling this story forever, except that the phone rang in 2005. And it was an auction house from New York City called Swan Galleries. They were alerting us to the fact that a Townsend descendant had offered an item for sale they were pretty sure we were going to want to bid on, and it was a Bible. Well, we already had several Bibles in our collection, but they were right. We wanted this one particularly, and we paid $10,000 for it because this Bible changed our story forever. Before we bought this Townsend slave Bible, we had no idea there was any slavery here. Frankly, we had no idea there was any slavery anywhere in our area. We were just completely oblivious, but here were the names. Many names like Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susanna, Harry, Susan, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, another Susanna, Marianne, Jane, and Gabriel. And not just names, but days when they were born, years when they were born, how they were related to each other, mothers and sons and daughters, and in 2 cases, how they died. And then a second page went on to tell us about Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh, and to confirm in writing that these were slaves that had belonged to Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay. And so at that point, I did a whole year-long exhibit talking about that slave Bible, and that led me to research other documents. And I uncovered other enslaved people that weren't in that record, like John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, her son Amos Burling, and then 2 people whose records I found, distinct individuals, but the record didn't have a name. So I call those 2 folks the unnamed child and the unnamed man. Now, all of these people had a few things that I could know about them, points in time when they were sold, when they were freed, but no one had a full story of a whole life until I learned about Elizabeth, whose nickname was Liss. Now, just a word about this image. This isn't an old portrait of Liss. Enslaved people were not given this honor of having their portrait painted. So this is an artist's interpretation that I had done. And what my research showed was there were twice as many enslaved people in this household than family members, 20 over the course of time. And so now our museum has added a slave's quarters in counterpoint to the fancy bedrooms where the family lived to give every visitor a chance to consider how they would have lived. Certainly not all 20 in this small room, but perhaps in the attic above or the basement below, or in farm buildings or outbuildings that they had on their property. And so this is a story of slavery not in the South, not during the Civil War. These are people who lived through America's founding, people who we need to remember and make visible again. We need to find room in the story of the founding of America for them. And that founding in our household really takes off in 1775 when the father, Samuel Townsend, joined our New York Provincial Congress. This was like the New York satellite of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And they were in a real minority, these patriots. Most Long Islanders were on the British side. And so that's why Samuel took a solemn oath of secrecy. He was meeting with these other congressmen in New York every day for a year and a half, trying to plan the revolution. And they didn't want their neighbors on the British side to find out what they were up to. So Samuel wasn't a spy, but he was certainly sneaking around quite a bit. And then we had the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. We've declared we want to be America, our own free country. And just 1 month later, a battle was brewing in Brooklyn, a battle for Long Island. Now, the head of our New York Congress was a general, General Nathaniel Woodhull. And Samuel Townsend knew him very, very well. General Woodhull wasn't in Brooklyn where this battle was brewing. He was right next door in Jamaica, Queens, and he needed men. He needed 500 more soldiers to enter the battle. He gave Samuel his important letter requesting these troops to go and find George Washington and wait for his return letter. Was Woodhull going to get the 500 men? Washington was wishy-washy. Maybe he could, maybe he couldn't. Woodhull writes back through Samuel Townsend, I need these men immediately. I am being surrounded. Finally, Samuel is instructed by Washington to give an audible return message. So vital, he didn't even want it to be written on paper. And the message was this: you're being abandoned. Washington had no choice. He could not win the Battle of Long Island. He was vastly outnumbered and surrounded on three sides. All that Washington could do was, in a deep fog that fell over his army, get little boats and secret his troops over to Manhattan Island. So that even though the British had successfully beaten him in that battle, when the fog lifted, they realized he and his army had gotten away. So they survived to fight another day, but Samuel Townsend went back home to Oyster Bay. And so after we lost this battle, and after that general was struck by the British with a sword and later died of his wounds, all of Long Island was taken over by the British, and all of New York City became British headquarters. So our house that you see in this drawing on the bottom side became British headquarters in our town. And every time a commander and his regiment would come into Oyster Bay, they would stay in our household. And there were a whole series of these regiments and commanders, one after another. But the one that people really remember is this fellow, Colonel John Graves Simcoe. He commanded a regiment called the Queen's Rangers. I love these reenactors in their uniforms. You'll see that the Queen's Rangers didn't wear red coats, they wore green. Simcoe understood the value of camouflage. He actually came to our household 3 different times, and he would have his daily officers' meetings in this room, our parlor. And Simcoe was a very interesting man, even though he's been portrayed as a villain in shows like Turn. The family said that he was the most honorable of all the commanders who lived here. And he believed that slavery was morally wrong. Before he was given command of this regiment, the Queen's Rangers, He requested to raise a regiment of escaped American slaves and lead them into battle on the British side, but the British Army wouldn't let him do that. After the war was lost, he went up to Canada, became the governor of Upper Canada, founded the city of Toronto, and passed the first anti slavery laws in Canada. So when you learn about the Civil War and the Underground Railroad, you really have Colonel Simcoe to thank that these enslaved people had somewhere to go where they could be free, Canada. Now, this is the room where he stayed in our house, this nice, spacious bedroom. And in March of 1779, after he had come in the fall of 78 and he was going to stay the whole winter, he invited his very good friend to come and have a little vacation and stay in that room with him for a few weeks. And that was Major John Andre. Everybody who loves Revolutionary War spies knows his name because Andre was the British spy master. He was this charming man who really used his personality and his charisma to get people to reveal things to him. And he was the one who coordinated the big spy operation that became the plot with Benedict Arnold to give up West Point Fort. But this was a whole year before that. This was March of 1779. And you can imagine Liss serving both Simcoe and Andre in that room in her role as a household slave. Now, Liss is described later on by Robert as being too fond of the British officers and too fond of company. And I can only imagine the conversations that Simcoe and Andre had with her. Simcoe might have spoken to her about her possibility of being a free person in a way that no one had ever done before. He might have really respected her personhood in a way that was totally unique to her up to that point. So, this is the spring of 1779. Now, if you back up to the fall of 1778, this is when the cousin of that fallen general, Abraham Woodhull, way out on Long Island in Setauket, first began the Culper spy ring. And he was ferrying the letters across to Fairfield with the help of Caleb Brewster, a lieutenant in Washington's army. But he also had some help in Manhattan. He talked in 1778 in November of having recruited someone he described of as a faithful friend who would give him weekly reports that were the most reliable news, and how this person was the most high end character of New York City, this very important person. Now, I could never prove that this was really Robert Townsend, but because of the way Woodhull later describes Robert when he becomes the full fledged spy Culper Jr., I think he's talking about the same person. Now, at this time, Robert is running a store in lower Manhattan. He has a partner named Oakman. And even more interestingly, he rents a room from Abraham Woodhull's sister. So Woodhull, riding his horse from Setauket, can come into Manhattan and just say he's visiting a sister, then knock on Robert's door and get all the news that Robert has collected since they last met. Now, in the spring of 79, Simcoe and his Queen's Rangers are ready to depart Oyster Bay. And as they left on May 18th, somebody else was with him. Liss escaped somewhere in his wagons or in his regimental group. As they departed, she left with them. It's pretty incredible the bravery it must have taken for Liss as about a 17-year-old to risk the punishment of being a runaway for the promise of becoming a free person. Now, 8 days after she escaped, we got this letter in our collection, probably our most important letter that we own about Liss. It's the spy Robert Townsend writing to his father. At the bottom of the first page, he says the Queen's Rangers are now beyond Kingsbridge. Kingsbridge was a physical wooden bridge at the tip of Manhattan. So it seems as though Robert is following the regiment from the rear. He says, if I see any of the officers, I'll make inquiry for Liss. I'll ask about her. Then he says, I think there's no probability of your getting her again. Believe you should reckon her among your other dead losses. Now, that's a pretty curious thing to say because typically, if your valuable slave escaped, you would put one of those runaway slave ads in the paper. But Samuel Townsend never did that. Then Robert goes on to pointedly mention Colonel Simcoe's name. He says, I'm surprised that Colonel Simcoe would permit her to go. He certainly must have known it when they left Oyster Bay. Now, not long after that escape, Liss left the Queen's Rangers Regiment, who were going into battle in New Jersey, and she was re-enslaved by an unnamed British officer in New York City. And so now she's right in New York City, right at the time when Robert becomes the lead spy. Robert became lead spy in New York City, the spy called Culper Jr., because Abraham Woodhull was getting stopped by the British. He was going from Setauket to New York, back and forth, and the British were suspicious of him. And so he urged Robert to become lead spy, and Woodhull stayed way out in Suffolk County and sent couriers back and forth to bring Robert's letters out to him. Now, here's a look at just a little snippet of one of his letters, and it's amazing how much Robert puts in just one little phrase. He says to Washington, I have received your dictionary. And here's just an image of what that dictionary really was. Benjamin Talmage had taken a real dictionary and written out all the important words in alphabetical order and assigned them each a number. This way, when the spies got this list of numbers and words, they could, in their letters, use numbers. And if anyone intercepted that letter, they wouldn't know what word it represented. He goes on to say, I'll be glad to have the stain as soon as possible. That word stain actually means invisible ink. And as you were learning in the introduction, John Jay's brother, James Jay, had created a new invisible ink technology just for the Americans. It had two liquid parts. One liquid called the stain would completely disappear as long as you used good quality white paper. You could write with this liquid between the lines of another letter. Then when that letter was delivered, the person on the other side needed another chemical called the counterpart. And once he brushed that on, all of your words would magically reappear. The British never found out about our stain and counterpart, luckily for our guys. Now, right after Robert becomes lead spy, we have the one and only mention of a very interesting person, a mysterious woman who was called 355. That's the dictionary code number for the word lady. Abraham Woodhull describes this 355 as being someone of his acquaintance, which might imply someone he hasn't known forever, but has just met. And he says with her assistance, they shall be able to outwit them all. So this woman has some method, some way of getting around being discovered. Now, we'll never know for sure if Liss was 355, the woman who was now assisting Robert and the other Culper spies. But as an enslaved person, she would have been almost invisible. And serving this British officer, she would have been able to move about almost unseen. It's an interesting thought to think that Robert, who had joined this loyalist volunteer company and was wearing his own homemade redcoat and standing guard outside British headquarters, might have been getting information from an enslaved woman, enslaved right inside that house, who might have slipped out and given him some intelligence. Again, I don't insinuate that I can prove this, but I think Liss has a great chance of being that 355. Now, Robert, in his letter to his father, urged that his father should write her off and that he essentially didn't have any idea where Liss was. But I actually found several entries in Robert Townsend's ledger book during the time when he was a spy, when he is purchasing Liss several items. He's buying her tea and he's buying her a thimble and thread. And so while he is implying to his father he doesn't know where Liss is, he knew right where she was. Now the Benedict Arnold treason plot happens. John Andre is caught by the Americans in the woods near West Point. Benedict Arnold's able to escape on the British warship, the Vulture, and poor John Andre is hanged as a spy. Now, Benedict Arnold comes to New York City and begins spy catching. He rounds up over 40 suspected spies, but Robert slips through his net and writes in one of his spy letters, "I am happy to think that Arnold does not know my name." Because there was this big roundup of spies when Arnold came to Manhattan, Robert closed up his shop down here on Hanover Square and broke off his partnership with this man, Oakman, and actually disappeared. He left the city for 3 months. When he finally came back into New York, he moved his business all the way over to Peck Slip, which was, at that time, was in a very out of the way place. He ceased advertising his business in the local papers and even stopped writing letters with the spy ring. He said, "After this, I'm not going to write down anything, not even in invisible ink, but I will meet with Abraham Woodhull outside the city and just tell him the information in person." Now the war was beginning to end, and in 1782, something incredible happened. Liss is now about to be forced to leave New York and go to Canada with her British master. And she comes to Robert and asks him to buy her back. She applied to Robert to repurchase her so that she wouldn't have to go up to Canada. And he did. Now, this purchase is interesting. He actually pays his father Samuel for the value of Liss, who had originally been his father's slave. On Robert's side of the ledger, he's very vague. He doesn't give her name. He just says the money is for a Negro wench. But on his father Samuel's side of the transaction, he says this is money from Robert Townsend's personal account and that it is for Liss. So that confirms this actually did happen in their record books. And at this very time, Robert writes his last spy letter to Talmadge. He hand carried his final spy letter up into Westchester and put it into Talmadge's hands. Now, Liss is living at Peck Slip with Robert, and when he took her into his home, she was 3 months pregnant. Perhaps that was why she didn't want to go to Canada. And the child which she then had in February of 1783 is a boy, I believe, named Harry, who Robert later describes as mulatto or mixed race. So Harry's father is a white man. It's even possible that it is Robert himself, or perhaps her British master, or someone else. But of all the 20 enslaved people owned at the Townsends' home, Harry is the only one who's described as mixed race. Now, Robert, meanwhile, has come to the belief that slavery is wrong himself personally, and he has an Irish housemaid who's doing the cleaning at his Peck Slip apartment. And so when Harry was about 6 months old, he's approached by a woman who's recently widowed named Anne Sharwin. Anne Sharwin wants to purchase Liss and baby Harry. And Liss knows Anne Sharwin and wants to go live in her household. And so Robert brokers this deal, but he wants a special agreement on the part of Anne. He wants Anne to promise that if she ever wants to leave New York, she will let him know so that he can repurchase Liss back and she can stay in New York. And Robert believes that this widow agrees to this. And so he sells Liss and Harry and goes about his business. But the widow didn't stay a widow for long. After just 1 year, she remarried a wealthy merchant named Alexander Robertson. And there's his silhouette on the side of the screen. This wedding seems to have been over as soon as it started. Alexander Robertson perhaps acted inappropriately with Liss and caused the new bride to get angry. Liss caused what was described of as a separation and derangement in the marriage, which ended as soon as it had started. But somehow Alexander Robertson retained ownership of Liss and baby Harry, who was now 2 years old. Maybe for spite or maybe for money, Alexander Robertson kept the baby at his house in New York and sold Elizabeth south to Charleston, South Carolina, a truly horrific place to be enslaved. This is the name of the ship that she traveled on, the brig Lucretia. And the man who captained that ship had become notorious, the notorious Captain Tinker, who people in New York knew would kidnap free Black people, take them down to Charleston, and sell them back into slavery. He was so notorious for this that this ad and others appeared in the New York papers frequently. This reads, "A hint, now riding in this harbor, Captain Tinker, who will probably sail for Charleston in a day or two. She has on board a considerable number of Negroes. Some of these distressed objects were seen wringing their hands, praying to their relentless proprietors that they might be permitted to remain in New York. But by these hardened people, their petitions were treated with disdain. It would be well for free Negroes to be upon their guard, lest they should meet with some kidnappers and share the same fate many have heretofore done." But Liss, remember, was not free. She was not kidnapped. She was simply sold and put down in the hold of that ship, along with all the other goods that were going south to Charleston. Now, as she is landing on the dock in Charleston, a group called the New York Manumission Society is having their very first meeting in New York. This was a group that wanted to end slavery by law right after the Revolutionary War. They were founded by John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton was also a key member, as well as the spy Hercules Mulligan. And Robert Townsend quickly joined the group too. They wanted to end slavery, but they essentially weren't able to do it because they could not get the votes. They couldn't get the votes to pass these laws. And so, just as Liss is down in Charleston, Robert has no idea, and he's becoming a member of this manumission society in New York. Now, the man who enslaved her in Charleston is another incredibly interesting figure. His name was Captain Richard Palms, and way back in 1770, he was the instigator of the Boston Massacre. He was a very strong man, a very aggressive and angry person. And in the depictions of the Boston Massacre in artwork, you'll always see Palms as the man with a giant club in his hand. He literally struck a British soldier with that club, and that's what got the bullets flying. And then this man later on owned Liss. He also was famous for another reason. When John Adams famously went to Paris to, quote, help Benjamin Franklin negotiate with the French, Richard Palms was on board that ship serving as Adams' personal bodyguard. He took Adams and his son by carriage to Paris so they could meet with Benjamin Franklin. Now, in my book, when you read it, you will see so many incredible coincidences of history, and you're about to hear about another one. At the same time that Richard Palms was in Paris with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, Robert Townsend's older brother Solomon was there too. I know it seems hard to believe, but he was there also meeting with Benjamin Franklin to get this, an oath of allegiance to America. So Solomon, with his oath from Franklin in hand, came back in the same convoy as Captain Richard Palms back to America. Meanwhile, 2 years have gone by before Robert finds out that Liss is in Charleston. And when he finds out, he and that brother Solomon frantically write to men who they believe will care about the anti-slavery movement and will help them buy Elizabeth back up to New York. These letters, which I discovered at the East Hampton Library, are full of all kinds of incredible details about the men who helped bring Liss back to New York. There was a real wrinkle in her return because the anti-slavery group that Robert had joined had succeeded in passing one law, a law that prohibited the importation of slaves into New York from other states. So Liss's return actually was illegal and had to be done secretly. It's incredible, but I do believe Liss did get back to Oyster Bay. This is a Baptist church record from 1789 with Samuel Townsend listed as a member of this Baptist church, and right across from him, Elizabeth, a Black woman. On the next page, we see his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Sally. In many books about the Culper spy ring, the Townsends are mistakenly identified as Quakers, but they were in fact Baptists. Now, 1 year after this record, I believe I found Elizabeth again in the 1790 First Federal Census of America. She was no longer in Oyster Bay. She was living in what's now Massapequa in a giant mansion owned by a man named David Richard Floyd Jones. Here she is, free Elizabeth, as a paid servant in this magnificent mansion called Fort Neck House. This incredible space was standing until the 1950s when it burned down. This is a look at the great room. I just imagine Liss in there as a servant, cleaning or cooking or helping to raise the children of this household, but finally being paid as a free person. There's even incredible images of the inside of this house from a WPA photography project in the years before it burned down. I imagine Liss walking up that floating staircase or passing through that arched doorway. But it's that 1790 census where she disappears from view. She's listed as a single woman in this census with her name written out. But after that, she may have become married or joined the household that was headed up by a man. Once a single woman became married, only her husband's name would be listed in the census, and the woman would just be a number in a column. I don't even know if she ever had a last name or if she was always just known as Elizabeth. So that 1790 record is the final record I found of her. But we do know this, that slavery finally ended in New York after 201 years on July 4th, 1827. So I hope that all New Yorkers this July 4th will remember that that is not just our day of independence as a country, it's the day of emancipation for enslaved people in New York. And so this is where I'm going to leave you to ponder all these small hidden stories of slavery in New York and to think about all the people whose identities, whose stories essentially vanished from view. And we can include them in our story of the founding of America. We can wed the story of patriotism and enslavement into one story of our founding. And I hope you've been listening and thinking up some great questions for me, because now it's going to be your turn to start the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing this and we're going to go back to Q&A mode.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for a really incredibly fascinating presentation and beautiful images. And it was so clear. And I want to mention to everybody, we see the book behind you and Tiffany, and I have it beside me. We have it, Hannah's letting everyone know, we have it for sale from our store. If you want to read the historical records that they are drawing from, you guys have done such a terrific job of citing the records. And I learned so much more about the American Revolution because that has not been my focus at the Spy Museum. And so I learned a lot. And I want to, Chris, your husband has been answering some questions from the audience and he's giving beautiful answers. So I'm not going to reiterate this, but I am going to ask some that I have, and I think they play off some of the questions our audience has. How did the British officer, when she's run away with the Queen's Rangers, and maybe she's already passing intelligence. Who knows? Maybe she's just run away, or maybe it's a long game she and Robert are playing. We can't know. But how did she get like re-enslaved? I mean, how does that happen? She just...
Well, one of the things that I learned was that the place that the Queen's Rangers immediately went after they left Oyster Bay, they went up beyond Kingsbridge above Manhattan, and they were part of this enormous force, this force that was secretly gathering on the British side to attack Stony and Verplank's Point. And the British won that battle. They captured Stony and Verplank's Point, and this is where we find out that Andre was also there. John Andre was the first person on horseback to enter into Stony Point after the battle was won, kind of, like, yay, we won this battle, to make a big parade and show that they were there. So Simcoe and the Queen's Rangers are now going to keep fighting. they're going to go into skirmishes in New Jersey. But Andre actually went back into his headquarters in New York City. And so it may be that she traveled into New York City with Andre.
Are you,
And then he set her up in a household with a British officer. Or it could be that she would have felt comfortable around him. Maybe she hitched a ride with him into New York City. And so the slavery, the promise of freedom that the British were offering enslaved Americans wasn't necessarily immediate. It would be after the war.
right?
So
right.
you were promised your freedom, but only after the conflict. And over 3,000 escaped American slaves were taken by the British up to Canada and became free people after the war.
One of our guests just asked about the title, combining espionage and enslavement, and wondering about whether enslaved people were spies. We can't say for sure about Liss or Elizabeth, but I will tell you, we certainly know enslaved people that were spies. One of our favorite spies at the International Spy Museum is James Lafayette. So I would ask you to take a look. We have videos about him if you want to look at our YouTube channel and visit the museum, because you can learn more about Lafayette. There may be some other enslaved.
And I would also say, right, Tiffany Cato, Hercules Mulligan's enslaved man.
Yes.
He was part of that. And we also know that there was a man down south when Simcoe and Andre were down at the siege of Charleston, a man named Barney, who escaped from slavery. And Simcoe says to Andre, when you're done questioning him and getting information out of Barney, send him back to me, because I'm going to keep him with my regiment. Barney ended up being a trumpeter for the regiment and being so gallant in battle that after the war, Simcoe brought him to Canada and got him a soldier's pension. So this idea of extracting information or using enslaved people to pass information isn't unique to this story. It exists in other records.
Nor to the Revolutionary War, certainly. This continued and was something during the American Civil War as well. Lots of people, and I think Chris has been answering this behind the scenes. We know she had one child, Harry. Do we think she had any other children? Do we know of any other descendants?
Yeah. The problem is that we can't track her specifically because we don't know if she ever had a last name. So like Harry, even Harry, there are 3 or 4 enslaved people who become free in Oyster Bay named Harry, and we don't know which one is which. And we also don't know if they chose a last name or what that last name would have been.
And also, like Claire said at the end of the presentation, because married women basically became invisible in the census, we don't know, because we don't know who she married, if she married. She may be in future censuses with her family listed, but she would not be listed by name at that point.
One thing that came out in the book that it's been fun for us at the museum, when you look at this circuit that the intelligence traveled, and we're like, why couldn't they just go that way? Like, it took so long. And I was talking to my colleagues, Hannah and Shauna, and I was like, it's in the book. They're fretting about how long the intelligence takes. And why was it that path?
There's actually a great spy letter that just says it perfectly, and it's written in code numbers. And this is a letter that I often have students decode for me. And Abraham Woodhull actually writes, every letter is being stopped at the entrance of New York, and every man is searched, so that for the future, every letter must be written with the invisible ink and must be taken the long way around. Because New York, the British knew about invisible ink. They had their own kinds, 2 different kinds, and they were looking for anything suspicious. If a letter would have gone the short way, they would have got caught and they would have been hanged to death. So their reason for succeeding is that they went so far around, except that Washington complained that he often got the messages too late to be helpful.
Okay, so gosh, we wish we could. People are like, is she a spy or not? We can't. That 355 drives all of us crazy. Are are there other people? We hear about other women. Anna might be her. Do you have reasons that you think 355 might in particular be Liss or Elizabeth?
I'm going to have to put the kibosh on the whole story of Anna Strong. And I know that's just a devastating blow to some people because, as often I'm told, it's a great story. But we're dedicated to primary source document as evidence. And there is zero evidence that Anna Strong had a clothesline code and helped the Culper spy ring. I'm sorry. And it actually doesn't even make plausible sense because they did not ever put the letters in a drop box of any kind. They only would meet in person. They also didn't need help connecting. They had predetermined meeting days, times, and places already established. And if a fellow spy would not show up, they would not meet. They wouldn't leave their letter there. They would just make a new meeting. So Caleb Brewster didn't need to know where to land his boat. And out on Long Island Sound, he would not have been able to see her clothesline, especially when he traveled at night. It's simply implausible. So I'm sorry.
Chris, there was a question that Chris answered, but I think it's worth doing on the video so people can hear it later when we post this. How could Liss, how could she meet with Robert in New York? And I think people don't understand that there was still movement even for enslaved people, if you two would comment on that.
Yeah. I feel like I've left you out, Tiffany. Do you want to
No, that's okay, Claire. I take it and run. I'll just fill in the holes.
One of the things we really know Robert did, because it's mentioned by his relatives, is he was part of this loyalist volunteer company, and he had a homemade red coat that he put on. And this red coat survived after the war. It was in the household, but we don't have it anymore. But his nephew teased him about how he had the red coat on and was standing guard outside British headquarters, which was right by Bowling Green at 1 Broadway in New York City. Now imagine if Liss was enslaved by a high-ranking British officer who had come to British headquarters for some reason. How great is that? Liss doesn't even have to know how to read and write or send a written message. Robert's standing right outside the door, and she could just walk out and say something to him.
And again, we also have record of Liss showing up in Robert's logbooks for his store. So it could be something as simple as she is sent on an errand to go get dry goods and she goes to Robert's store. So we can see that we know she was at least several times visiting his place of business.
And people did move around. I mean, I worked on the history of the Mid-Atlantic for a long time, and it is always, I think, surprising to people that you could be hired out. You could earn money as an enslaved person from some, that's how people could potentially buy their own freedom or freedom of their family members. So it's such a, and this book took me back further just in understanding the landscape, which we really can't conceive of, nor do I think we really want to, but trying to look at it through our 21st century eyes. I've got to ask a question about Robert, even, we're fascinated by Liss and Elizabeth, but why, tell us a little bit about how his spying came to light. You mentioned it was through handwriting analysis. Can you tell us a tiny bit more about that?
He had some beautiful handwriting. I've gotten so interested in him, and I've researched him for so long. I can see his handwriting a mile away. And there was
actually, Claire, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Something that's really interesting is some of the documents that Claire pulled out is if you look at like family logbooks that you'll see like his father's hand is, very heavy, or his brother's hand. And then when Robert writes something in the book, it's like this loopy, lacy script. So it's a very distinct, like Claire said, once you see it compared to other scripts, you can pick it out in a lineup right away. It's definitely not just a typical scrawl. Sorry.
And the man who figured it out had a great name, Morton Pennypacker. He was obsessed with the Culper spy ring in the 1920s, and he happened to get his hands on quite a big cache of Townsend family papers. He had a girlfriend who was a librarian in the Hamptons, and he ended up giving the Hampton Library that whole piece of the collection, which has made my work interesting, but they're great to work with out there.
Well, that I know we all just share resources.
Sure, he got a big wheelbarrow and just like rolled it up to the house, I think, and just like took everything away. But yeah, you can really tell that he's Culper Jr. once you know that.
I am so fascinated by the fact that he was able to keep his role. He just did not want to be known at all.
And it's so interesting I'm sorry. It's so interesting in his personal writings and papers. And again, we go into this in the book, but you really see him struggling with life after the war and thinking about like, what is my responsibility to my community? What does a person, like, there's a search for meaning. He's chastised by other family members in a number of letters, for saying, well, you should really go out and do something. You just sit at home and sulk. And it's heartbreaking when you realize what he actually did. And then you realize that he is struggling to come to terms with everything, because you think about it, the war was only a few years of his life, and that's what we focus on. But there is so much of Robert's story before that and so much of Robert's story after that that is still significant, and his development as a person and emotionally. There may have been, we're not diagnosing anything, but there may have been some depression that he dealt with that really comes out in his letters. That's another one of the sort of fascinating primary source resources that we were able to use is, Claire really looked in detail at like even just the passages that he chose to copy, even that someone else wrote, but he felt that those were significant enough to write down. And they talk about, again, what is your responsibility to other people? And so really seeing how he sort of had to come to terms with this brief period of his life. And he didn't want it to define him. And he definitely had mixed emotions about so much of what went on, that you really see a depth in him. I think it's easy to almost think of him in a very one-dimensional way of, oh, he's a spy. And, we have a mental image of what that means, but he was a much more nuanced and deeply thoughtful individual. And you really see him struggling with some of that for the rest of his life, of how to find meaning now that that's over.
Well, as we wrap up our hour together, I want to thank you all for the book brings to light so many different characters. And we've got, as you see, here's Colonel Andre, and we've got Benjamin Franklin doing a cameo, and, and we're the ties between Charleston and Long Island. It just is really fascinating. And bringing Liss's story to light is incredible. And as we roll into the 4th of July, I loved you marking, this was also a change.
Day,
and the book gives you a greater perspective on what it was like to live at that time of the American Revolution. And I really thank you both for your work in doing that. And I want to invite folks to, come to our coming up programs next Thursday, July 8th. We have Spy Chat with Chris Costa and Ambassador Nathan A. Sales. Please check our website for that program and others. Also, I don't know, is your site open yet, Claire?
Yes, we are now open to the public, and we have some incredible new exhibits to really show both sides of the household, the Townsend family and the enslaved people, and some amazing technology we now have, and some really great dioramas too.
So come, visit the Spy Museum, visit Raynham Hall, and feel free to contribute to either of our organizations, because we really appreciate it. It keeps all of us going. And check out the book and have a happy and safe 4th of July. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.